Welcome to Quality Time with MoreSteam. I am your host, Dan Swartwout. On some episodes of the podcast, we talk about the theory and tools of continuous improvement, and that's great. I love those episodes, but this episode is a little different. On this episode, I am talking to somebody who spent decades actually doing the work of continuous improvement. Today's guest is Steve Adams. Steve graduated from West Point and served in the Army Corps of Engineers before starting a 30-year career at Procter Gamble. At P&G, Steve built and managed quality systems, taught teams the fundamentals of improvement, and led projects that solved real problems on the production floor. Steve's perspective comes from years of actually running operations, and stick around because at the end of this episode, we'll feature some audio from Street Stats, which is MoreSteam's YouTube series focused on practical, business-friendly approaches to statistics. If you want to use statistics to make good, smart business decisions, then Street Stats is the series for you. So stick around for that, but first, let's get started with my conversation with Steve Adams. Today, we are lucky enough to be joined by Steve Adams. Steve has a long history in the world of engineering and quality. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Dan. Glad to be here.
We are absolutely thrilled to have you here. And before we dive into your experience and your credentials and everything that you've done in the world of quality, if you could give us a little bit of background information about yourself, that would be fantastic.
I worked for Procter Gamble for 30 years. And since that time, I've contracted for, I guess it's about another 15 years after that. I originally went to school and graduated from West Point in 1974, got a MBA from the University of Scranton in 83. My work experience has been primarily in quality system deployment. I've been a global auditor. I've done improvement projects. I've taught statistics. So this is very much on point for me.
What a fascinating background. And that's the first thing I wanted to ask you about is how did your military engineering foundation shape the way you approached quality and manufacturing later at Procter & Gamble?
Well, I guess one major factor is it got me in the door. When I left the military, Procter & Gamble paper was recruiting a lot of people because they were building new plants and had to get a lot of managers. And they decided that it's easier to train a quote unquote engineer to be a manager than it is to train a manager to be an engineer. So they attended a lot of conferences where people from the military would separate and look for civilian jobs. So it got me in the door. As an engineer, I did, of course, have opportunity to, I guess you'd say, work with numbers and plans and projects and things like that. But in truth, my statistical focus really picked up once I joined Procter & Gamble.
You spent 30 years at Procter & Gamble with 11 of those years on the floor, right?
In the Mahoopany manufacturing plant in northeastern PA, that's correct.
What drew you to quality work once you got to P&G? Is that where they put you or is that where you gravitated?
I guess you'd have to say is that's where the opportunity was for me. And about 5 years into my career, Procter & Gamble as a company really joined up with the big total quality movement that was going on at the time. GE and Ford and others were very much getting on board with quality management, quality improvement. Hand in hand with that, P&G had recently acquired some pharmaceutical business. And so they now had a FDA exposure too. So they definitely had a lot of interest in upgrading their quality management process, if you will. So worked for me. I enjoyed working with the numbers and it looked like a good career path for me.
When we talked earlier last week, you mentioned Kepner-Trago analysis. Not everyone is familiar with what that is. For listeners who haven't used it, can you walk us through what it is and give us an example of Kepner-Trago in action?
Oh, sure. Kepner Trade-No, when I was back at the plant, we called it ATS, Analytical Troubleshooting. I've also heard it called Analytical Problem Solving. But the methodology really focuses on, and it's a very detailed methodology. So you don't use this methodology to solve simple problems. If it's a real tough problem, you're having a hard time wrestling to the ground, then ATS is a good approach. It focuses a lot on the use of the technique of what is and is not. So let's say you're having a problem on a line. One of the questions would be, well, is it on just this line? Or are we seeing on multiple lines? Because that then would kind of direct what you're doing. Where do you observe the problem? It is the rolls have been perforated and not before the rolls have been perforated. And you go through a series of questions like that to really hone in on where in the process could it be happening. And then, of course, you collect a lot of data. Another sometimes difficult thing to do is to figure out when did the problem truly start and what is the extent of the problem? Because most of the time, if you know exactly when the problem started, you can get a sense of what happened at the same time that might be related to the problem. Frequently, you just don't know it. You bump into it eventually through, your quality data collected. So you don't know exactly when a problem started. And the extent is also important. Is it intermittent? Is it in certain positions in your processor? So anyway, pretty rigorous, a lot of data collection, but it is pretty effective.
You worked extensively, Steve, with Centerlines at Procter Gamble. For people who aren't familiar with that term, what exactly is centerlining, and why does it matter so much in a manufacturing environment?
Absolutely. Imagine, if you will, a process is a black box, and coming into the black box, you have inputs, and going out of the black box, you have outputs. Well, in the black box, you have various, let's call them control knobs. And ideally, what you want to do is set those control knobs at the correct settings such that if you control the inputs, you will know and predict the quality of the outputs coming out the other side. So that's basically the concept. We use statistical tools with centerlining, so we don't what we call over control. If you do not use statistical tools, there's a tendency to over adjust the process, which adds extra variability to the process. So you want to make sure that if, your tensile strength has gone up 50 grams, is that truly a process shift, or did you just get real lucky on that data sample and happen to find an outlier?
Interesting. We haven't talked about Centerlines yet on the show, so this is some fascinating stuff. When you're talking about centerlining, how long did it take typically to see measurable improvements once you implemented proper centerlining on a production line?
Well, my experience is coming into an area where there virtually were no set center lines. We had very experienced, especially in the paper making operation of Procter Gamble. We had very experienced technicians running the process, but it wasn't unusual at all that first shift, they liked to run the process one way and they could get good results. And the next shift would come in, they like to run it a little bit different. So they would change the knobs around and still get acceptable product. But what we were trying to do is get everybody to run the process at the same center lines. There was a human side to this to overcome because the senior technicians really felt like, well, part of the reason I'm a senior technician is I know how to do this.
Right.
And to say, I really don't want you to use your experience except for problem solving. I do want you to use your experience a lot, but I don't want you to use it to pick today's process settings. So we went through that exercise for probably a couple of years before we finally got everybody on board to run to the right center lines. Now, the next thing is, what are the right center lines? If you're lucky enough to have a fairly simple process with, let's say, maybe 10 or less meaningful control parameters, you can probably test your way to figure out what the right settings for those 10 things are. For example, once again, on a paper machine, they would take 100 plus process settings for their paper machine. And then of those, which ones truly are the ones that make a difference and which ones can be centerline. Now, I'll take a step back. Some processes lend themselves to centerlining. Those are ones where you have a really good control on the process inputs and you have good control on the process itself, the machine health, the setup, et cetera, and so forth. Now, if you have a process that is subject to more variability, let's say variability in the environment or the water quality or the pulp you're using, then you really are making necessary control adjustments. And those knobs can and should be adjusted to maintain finished product quality. So let's put it this way, you cannot centerline driving a car because you're given a steering wheel and a brake pedal and a gas pedal, because sometimes you need to use the brake pedal and sometimes you need to use the gas pedal, and you always turn in the steering wheel. So you can't set a center line for those three control parameters.
Thanks, Steve. I didn't know a lot about this topic before recording this episode, but one topic I know a lot about is this short break. MoreSteam's enterprise process improvement platform includes the tools, training, and software you need to transform your organization into a problem-solving powerhouse. Join the ranks of Fortune 500 companies that trust MoreSteam for their enterprise process improvement. Visit MoreSteam.com to learn more. Also, I want to take just a moment to thank you for listening to Quality Time with MoreSteam. You can email the show at qualitytime@moresteam.com. And if you're enjoying the show, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast service. And now back to my conversation with Steve Adams. In the world of continuous improvement, there are certain icons. And one of those icons is, of course, W. Edwards Deming. And you are somebody who can say that you actually have Deming's autograph. How did that happen, Steve? And what was your interaction with Deming like?
As I mentioned, quality became a very big thing in industry, and Procter Gamble in general and the paper division of Procter Gamble in particular very much wanted to get on board with quality management. I was lucky enough to work at a plant where they sent a large number of the, I guess you'd call them the higher leadership of the plant, to Deming seminars. And so I attended a Deming seminar, which was, I guess, a 4-day seminar in San Diego. And he went through his 14 points of total quality management. And if you look at P&G's quality system, especially as it evolved, it very much built around a lot of the total quality management principles that Deming had. Now, there's a lot of ways to organize for quality. ISO's has a good, very broad system that a lot of people use. And good manufacturing practices is certainly good. If you're in a regulated area, you got to have those in place. But Procter & Gamble felt that it really didn't cover all the bases the way that Deming mentioned, because there was a lot of management expectations in terms of having leadership buy-in and providing enough resources, and the managers and leaders actually being in touch with what's going on with quality on the manufacturing floor.
Of Deming's 14 points, Steve, do you have a favorite?
One which is not necessarily my favorite, but one that not everybody would think of, is to reduce competition between departments, which was certainly meaningful in my environment. We had a paper making operation, which took raw pulp and made it into giant rolls of paper. And we had converting areas, which took these giant rolls of paper and made them into paper towels and toilet tissue. Well, you could look better result-wise if you would continue to run the paper machine with a belt, we call it. But anyway, with part of your process beginning to wear, even though it made it more difficult for the next operation to be able to convert the paper. And there was always an ongoing struggle between the converting operation and the paper making operation in terms of who owns the downtime and scrap due to paper problems. And that's a good example of where you don't want to sub-optimize to allow one department to get high marks in quality at the expense of another department.
Steve, you had a brief stint at Ford between the Army and Procter and Gamble. What did you learn in automotive manufacturing that you carried with you into consumer products?
Ford at the time really was and still is a leader in terms of trying to apply quality tools. A bit of a digression, one of the products that I also was associated with was diaper making. And diaper making is not unlike a car in the sense that it's a manufactured product. So as a manufactured product, the quality of a Ford car is, a lot of it is determined by the quality of the parts they receive. So Ford is absolute death on its suppliers to make sure they conform to specifications and they properly define the specifications in the first place. Same sort of concept applies to diaper making. If that diaper is going to be a leaker, it's probably because one of the component webs is not properly up to spec or something.
After 30 years at Procter and Gamble, you moved into consulting. What prompted that move, and what are you working on now that you're applying all those decades of manufacturing and quality experience?
Well, as it turns out, my later career was in global quality for Procter & Gamble for the paper business. And one of my duties was to help develop and do the training that we would do for our auditors so they would know what to do. We had a program where you go out to all the Procter & Gamble sites to make sure they have implemented all the bits and pieces of the Procter & Gamble quality system. And my job was to put the training together and to give it to various people. That then became basically, I guess you'd kind of say, sort of like boot camp training for anybody who was going to be in the quality business to understand what all the pieces are, because it's a pretty broad training that covers a lot of areas. It's not just statistics, it's training, it's written procedures, it's laboratory, it's many, many pieces that you might not initially think of as being in quality management. Anyhow, when I left, there was an organization called Your Encore that was recruiting people who had retired from not just P&G, but other large organizations, and would contract them back so as not to violate any, you can't rehire or contract back people that you've retired kind of requirements. And I pretty much did the same thing. I provided the training, same training, and would go to sites and do assessment audits. Typically, these were locations that were trying to get prepared for a Procter & Gamble external audit. So they wanted to make sure they understood what all the requirements were and maybe have a second set of eyes to look at them to see, yeah, you look good or you might need some work here. And then more recently, I've pretty much been completely on the training side in terms of doing quality system development. QSD is what we call it now. And the consulting group has evolved down to a group called Boost. And if anybody happens to be interested, it is open to not just Procter & Gamble or their suppliers. It's anybody who might either just be starting an operation and want to make sure you've got all the bits and pieces that need to be in place in a good, well-founded quality system. Or if you happen to be ready to receive an audit from someone, it's also a good way to just refresh yourself that do you have all things. It's also been used quite a bit for as new people come into quality roles, it's a good way for them to get a very broad exposure to what would be a good quality system.
Steve, when you're working as a consultant and you go to a new client or new trainees, do you bring along your Deming autograph to help establish your credentials?
No, no, I'm afraid most of them might not even recognize Deming anymore. It's just as a kind of an aside, one of the slides I use when I talk about auditing is a slide with Columbo in it, because Columbo had a certain technique for getting to the bottom of things, getting questions answered. Anyway, this last time I asked them, does anybody know who Columbo is? And nobody in the class had a clue. So I'm afraid Deming wouldn't necessarily be viewed as the person that they needed to hear about.
Steve, I am absolutely floored that they do not recognize Columbo, Peter Falk, Columbo.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
A couple episodes back, somebody had referenced Dragnet. That's one of my favorite shows. Columbo is also one of my favorite shows. And I
Yeah.
know very well how Columbo would drag that information out of people. He'd be walking out the door, then he'd turn around. He's like, "Yeah, one more thing. And I was just thinking about this." And that's fantastic, Steve. How do you incorporate the Columbo slide? What do you tell people after they say we don't remember Columbo at all? How do you relate
yes.
Columbo to this work?
In the case of Columbo, he's of course trying to find that a bad person has done a bad thing. When we go in and audit and assess, we're not there trying to find that bad people have done bad things. We just want to find out what's going on. So the point of that particular slide is you need to use multiple approaches to get information. You have to talk to different people. You may have to explain what you want to know in several different ways before someone will say, "Oh yeah, we kind of do that. Here, let me show you." You might have to go back later that day to run into the guy who really has the answer you need to know. But when you were saying that, it did make me laugh. One of my favorite Deming quotes is, "In God we trust, all others bring data."
Oh, Steve, that's so great that you brought up Columbo. That makes me laugh. That really makes me smile. You know who directed the very first episode of Columbo?
Yeah.
Steven Spielberg.
Wow.
Yeah.
Boy, that makes him seem pretty old. I guess he is by now, though. Well, when you get a
Steve,
certain age, it's hard to believe how old people are.
this is a perfect lead into my last question. Looking back across your career, from West Point to the Army Corps of Engineers to Ford to 30 years at Procter and Gamble, so that's a lot of time. What's the one quality principle or practice that you think is most misunderstood or underutilized in manufacturing?
Let me answer the question a little bit differently. When I would
Sure.
go into a new site and a new site was trying to put a quality system in place, I would tell them that there were 18 areas that they needed to get in place. That if they could do two things right, the other 16 would follow. And that was leadership and self-assessment. Because if you've got leadership support and you've got good self-assessment, you will eventually continuously improve to have everything in place.
Steve, that was a fantastic answer. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us on the show. This has been a very entertaining and informative episode. You've taught me about some things I didn't know about before now. And we got to talk just a little bit about one of my all-time favorite shows. I might go home today and watch the episode where Dick Van Dyke is a photographer.
No, there you go.
Thank you so much for joining us on the show. This has just been tremendous. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Steve Adams. I found it to be very informative and a lot of fun. And now, as I promised earlier, I am going to play an episode of Street Stats for you. Since April, MoreSteam has been releasing weekly Street Stats episodes on YouTube. This is a short one that doesn't have a lot of visual elements, so I thought it'd be good to play on the podcast. But some of these Street Stats episodes you really need to watch on YouTube to get the full experience. All of these are available on YouTube. They're great, practical statistical advice from Kevin Keller. The YouTube videos have been doing really well. People seem to enjoy them, so check them out after you listen to this episode. It's Street Stats 23, Outside the Limits, but really in control.
Is your data outside the limits, but really in control? Let's take a second look at that moving range chart. Now, the X moving range chart is an incredibly powerful tool that allows us to assess whether or not our mean, or statistic of interest, is stationary, and the most recent observation is statistically in control or out of control. Now, if you had a great instructor for statistical process control, they taught you that for X bar and R charts, you first look at the variability chart, either a range chart or a standard deviation chart, then you look at the average chart. That was truly great advice. Most don't practice that, and we'll talk about why in a separate episode. But what about the moving range chart? If the data you are tracking is supposed to be stationary, then the moving range actually doesn't add much value. It is possible to get two extreme values just inside the upper and lower control limits of the X chart, but so what? Likely you will watch the process to see if that continues, right? Having team members take action on this becomes problematic. There are two possible signals that are realistic. There's overadjustment going on. The team members are reacting to individual observations. Sometimes the process isn't capable, and extreme values, but in control, might cause a reaction. Or variability has actually increased in the process. But probably the correct answer is to gather some additional data to better understand if that's the case. At the end of the day, if, and that's a big if, there's supposed to be a target value, or what we expect that statistic to be stationary, then the moving range really adds no value. So keep it simple. Track the individual value and reduce what has to be reacted to. Be careful out there. The streets are messy, and so is data. But remember, there's always a way.
That was Street Stats Outside the Limits, but really in control. There's over 30 Street Stats episodes on YouTube. Great, practical, business relevant statistical advice. Check that out. And thank you so much for listening to this episode of Quality Time with MoreSteam. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another great episode. Thanks again.